I'm standing in front of Christopher Saxton's map of the county of Warwickshire in the Midlands of England. Saxton's maps, he did one of the whole country and 34 others of each of the counties into which the country was divided, was the first accurate representation of the geography of England. It was commissioned in 1579 by Lord Burleigh, Queen Elizabeth's chief minister. Burleigh, for reasons of politics and maybe even spying, wanted to know his way around the country. But for people looking at the map, it was the first opportunity to have a sense of where your locality belonged in relation to the country as a whole. It takes us to the heart of Shakespeare country, to the world in which Shakespeare was brought up. Let's look more closely at it. In the centre of the county are the large towns of Coventry and Warwick. There is Kenilworth, where Queen Elizabeth visited her favourite, the Earl of Leicester. But a little to the south is Stratford, with the villages around it that Shakespeare knew so well. You'll notice that Stratford is on the edge of Warwickshire and Gloucestershire, and that's going to be important for Shakespeare, because he was the only dramatist of his time who set his plays in rural England, and in particular in Gloucestershire. There's a wonderful scene in his play Henry IV, Part 2, where Sir John Falstaff, who's recruiting soldiers for the army, goes down to Gloucestershire and meets a local justice of the peace and recruits the local men. And the language there is full of local Warwickshire and Gloucestershire dialect and references to these villages around Stratford. It's a small town. When Shakespeare went to London, it would have been a huge contrast. And to travel to London, he'd have gone to the south, through South Warwickshire, the edge of Gloucestershire, and on to Oxfordshire. This is a fascinating map for thinking about Shakespeare and provincial life, Shakespeare and small town England. In his play, The Merry Wives of Windsor, there's an opening sequence where the Warwickshire Justice of the Peace, Justice Shallow, and his friends come up to Windsor. But Shakespeare writes it in such a way that at the beginning of the play, you don't know it's Windsor. It might just as well be Stratford. There are references to the Cotswolds, the hills around Stratford, to Banbury cheese. Banbury was a nearby town in Oxfordshire. Of all his plays, Merry Wives of Windsor is the one that seems closest to Shakespeare's own experience of small town life, closest to his upbringing in Stratford-upon-Avon. From the moment of his arrival in London, Shakespeare was perceived as a provincial writer. He'd have had a strong Warwickshire accent. He hadn't been to Oxford or Cambridge like the other dramatists of the time. And the thing about going to university is that it tends to make you change your speech, start speaking the Queen's English. You maybe lose your regional identity. When Shakespeare arrived, he was mocked for being a country bumpkin from Warwickshire, from the edge of the Forest of Arden. Because if you look closely at the map, you'll see there is forest, woodland, wildland all around the town. So what was Stratford-upon-Avon like when Shakespeare was brought up there? And what sort of influence did his rural origin, his small town life, have on his plays, in particular, The Merry Wives of Windsor? Those are the questions that we're going to explore this week.